Watching Russia's Victory Day parade this weekend, you might think that that country is as powerful as it ever was. But in fact, this year's parade was dramatically scaled back from years past. The event commemorating the country's World War II victory over Nazi Germany is considered a centerpiece of President Vladimir Putin's rule, and it usually features a dizzying display of missiles and tanks. But this was the first time since 2007 that hardware was absent. You see, Russia is in trouble. The Kremlin attributed the scaled-back parade to Ukrainian terrorist activity. Many observers suggest that the change was due to potential drone strikes from Ukraine targeting military hardware during rehearsals. This week, a Ukrainian drone hit a high-rise apartment building in Moscow, about 5 miles from Red Square, where the parade takes place. And Ukraine has been stepping up drone and missile strikes deep into Russia's territory, bringing the war back to the country that started it. Late last month, the Ukrainian drone hit a high-rise in Yekaterinburg, more than 1,000 miles from Ukraine. As Bloomberg notes, the city of 1.5 million people served as a base for industry during World War II because it was then considered too far for attacks from Europe to reach. Ukraine is also using drones to attack Russia's oil infrastructure, hoping to hurt its export revenues. As the AP reports, Ukrainian drones have hit the oil refinery and export terminal in the Black Sea city of Tuapse 4 times since April 16th. Residents reported oily drops of black rain after the attacks, and oil from the explosions has seeped into the sea. These attacks and others like them are forcing more and more Russian people far from the front lines to grapple with the reality of war. That is as the stalemate on the front line itself continues. The Institute for the Study of War reported that in April, for the first time in nearly 2 years, Russia suffered a net loss of territory in Ukraine. That means that the territory it captured was less than the territory it lost to Ukraine in April. Now, none of this means that a Russian spring and summer offensive won't happen and won't eke back gains, but it suggests the difficulty in securing an outright victory in the war. And a war with no clear end could be a threat to Putin. Walter Russell Mead wrote this week in the Wall Street Journal that an agonizing stalemate would threaten Mr. Putin's grip on power and the future of Russia itself. The Financial Times reports that Putin's approval ratings have fallen to their lowest level since he announced a partial mobilization of reservists in September of 2022. European intelligence leaked to CNN and other outlets this month reveals that security around Putin has dramatically increased amid fears of a potential assassination attempt or coup coming from Russia's dissatisfied political elite. The report says that aides close to Putin have had surveillance systems installed in their homes. His cooks, bodyguards, and photographers are forbidden from using public transport. Staffers working with him can only use phones without the internet, and he spends much of his time in underground bunkers. These measures come amid a wave of assassinations of high-level Russian military and security figures. In December, a senior Russian general was killed by a car bomb, presumably by Ukrainian agents. The FT reports that Putin's security fears have caused the Russian government to crack down on mobile internet in recent months. Rolling mobile internet outages and blocks on social media apps and VPNs may also be aimed at silencing dissent. But if that's the aim, the measures appear to be backfiring. Several Russian bloggers and influencers have criticized the Russian government for the crackdowns. One based in Monaco addressed Putin in a video last month viewed by about 32 million people. She said, "The people are afraid of you." In an essay in this week's Economist, an anonymous former senior Russian official wrote, "For the first time since the conflict began, Russians are starting to imagine a future without Putin." People are also reeling from economic woes. While Putin's Russia has benefited from rising oil prices amid the U.S. war in Iran, it's also dealing with bruising labor shortages. As Ukrainian-born Alexander Kolyander writes in The Spectator, though Putin touts Russia's 2.1 unemployment rate as a sign of a booming economy, It's really a sign that the country is running out of workers. Military conscription doesn't help, but the real culprit is long-standing demographic decline. Of course, Vladimir Putin has time and again proven to be a wily and resilient leader. But it is becoming clearer and clearer that his aggression against Ukraine has cost his country dearly.
Putin says the war may be coming to an end, while the Trump administration says talks are in fact stalled. Is this a real diplomatic opening or mostly just strategic messaging from both sides right now?
You know, there's a lot of confusion, even in terms of any predictions. I mean, you do have to look at what President Trump said, and he said, hopefully, this temporary ceasefire is the beginning of the end, but I think accent on the word hopefully. And then, as you pointed out, Secretary Rubio said things are stalled. And then if you look at what Putin said, I always like to check the bottom line and the fine print. And what he's saying is, yes, things could be coming to an end, but he's saying, when he even said, I would be willing to sit down with Volodymyr Zelensky in a third country, but not to negotiate, to sign something that already is negotiated. So in other words, the likelihood of that happening very soon is not very great. So I think at this point, things are stalled. And the question is, can they somehow pull this out and get to some type of agreement, which is a big if.
It's very interesting. Check the small print. Both Russia and Ukraine do accuse each other of violating the Victory Day ceasefire. Was this truce ever really meant to advance negotiations, do you think? Could it hold longer?
You know, I think it was really a temporary measure at a very delicate moment. I mean, that parade was symbolic in so many ways, especially to Vladimir Putin. And to have, drone attacks by Ukrainians on Moscow would be an utter disaster. So I don't think, really, President Trump, certainly, who apparently asked both sides, he says, to have some type of, ceasefire, that it was a request simply to make sure this did not turn into a disaster. But in terms of long term, no. Immediately, both sides were accusing each other of violating. And in fact, today, I think the Russians were saying that Ukraine violated it 16,000 times. So that's kind of where we are at this point. Again, it didn't really solve much of anything, although you do have to say, Ben, that the fact that they are going to trade prisoners is a very good thing. That would be 1,000 on each side, and that's important.
Ukraine's drone strikes are reaching deeper into Russia, as you kind of alluded to there, and forcing tighter security around Moscow. How significant is that psychologically for both the Kremlin and for ordinary Russians?
I think it's very important. I mean, if you look at some of the polling, and again, it's very difficult to do polling in the middle of a war, and especially in Russia. But, indications are that Russians really are becoming very frustrated by the war. It's been going on for a long time. There is a lot of inflation. There are economic problems. People are there are reports of Russians being psychologically affected by this, depressed and worried about it. And then I think the biggest factor is shutting down the internet in Moscow, which was a very big deal. And a lot of Russians were very frustrated. They tried to go online. At points, they couldn't even get online. And that's an indication of something that I think is pretty deep, this frustration that, yes, the Kremlin is saying we need this for security, but some Russians are saying, no, it goes far beyond that. It's the Kremlin trying to control everything. So this is kind of, I'd say, a growing theme. It doesn't mean that this is going to be a revolution or anything like that, but there is discontent growing, and it's among a lot of different people.
Let's talk a bit more about those Victory Day celebrations, because they were noticeably scaled back this year. Less military hardware on display, and even reports about Putin potentially wanting Trump to help prevent strikes on Moscow. What does all of this actually mean?
You know, it was used by both sides, I think, again, in a psychological war. The Ukrainians essentially were saying, look, Vladimir Putin, because he was so afraid that Ukrainians would attack Moscow with drones, that he had to run to President Trump and ask for his help to intercede with Zelensky. Please don't fire. Now, the truth, I think, lies in the middle, that President Trump decided to ask both sides. But however that shook out, both sides were using it. So the Ukrainians, again, showing Putin as weak and scared. And then President Putin said, in a news conference after the May 9th, he said, well, security was one thing, very important to us, but also we were definitely, if there was anything coming from Ukraine, we were bound to reply. And in other words, we would fire back and they would hit Kyiv. And so he said, I told the Chinese, I told the Indians, and I told the Americans that, you know, there are a lot of diplomats who work in Kyiv, and it would be dangerous for them. So in other words, Putin is trying to use it to say, no, I'm not scared. I was actually threatening these countries with the possibility of what could happen in Ukraine. So again, you know, the war, it's very kinetic, as that word is used so much. It's very bloody and very cruel. But there's also this psychological part of it, which is really, really important, especially in the context of what we were just talking about, the vulnerability that Putin has somewhat at home, because the discontent at home.
It is a rare, pointed insight into one of the starkest secrets in Russia, President Vladimir Putin's security protocols. And a detailed intelligence report given to CNN by a source close to a European intelligence agency, portrays, predictably, a Kremlin in deep crisis. Cooks, bodyguards and photographers working with Putin must have surveillance systems installed in their homes, it says. Putin has stopped visiting military sites this year entirely, it says, in contrast to last year, often spending time in fortified bunkers and keeping clear of some of his main lavish residences like Valdai. A tactic aided by many of his appearances, and he is in the media a lot, being pre-recorded. His staff cannot use smartphones or public transport, the report adds. Visitors must be searched twice.
Putin increasingly isolated. These fears grow. I mean, just how paranoid is he right now? What are you learning?
Well, I think you don't really have to look very far. Just look at the plans for the Victory Day parade celebrating the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II for May 9th on Saturday. It's going to be the first time the Russian Defense Ministry announced in the middle of the night last week, trying to bury the news. In 20 years, they've done it without the usual tanks and armored vehicles and ballistic missiles. They usually trundle past Putin on Red Square because they're worried about Ukrainian drone strikes. Ukraine has really improved its ability to strike deep in the heart of Russia. They hit a luxury high-rise building just earlier today in Moscow with a drone strike, and that's clearly something that Putin is worried about. He's only really 2 fully fledged public appearances all year, and that is something that is an increasing concern in Russia. Just today, Putin replaced the head of the aerospace forces, which, among other things, is in charge of air defense. And the suggestion there, we don't know all the reasons, but they clearly haven't been doing everything they could with air defense in Russia. Ukraine has been very successful in striking Russian energy facilities, both supporting the war and all in Ukraine, and also fueling Russia's energy exports to fund the war. And that's something that they really have to be worried about.
Yes, and all of this is just incredible. The fact that the cooks and people who work around Putin can't use smartphones. I mean, what kind of devices are they even using? They have to be surveilled in their homes, that he himself is spending time in a bunker?
Yeah, well, the joke about Putin ever since coronavirus, the peak of the pandemic, where he basically went on lockdown with all but his very, very, very closest intimate circle, and that was where he came up with the whole plan for the Ukraine invasion. You may remember these really ludicrous scenes where he was meeting foreign dignitaries at opposite ends of this
giant table.
30-foot long table. The joke that he was the old man in the bunker, and really that's become true. You talk to people who know him, they say that he spends the vast majority of his time in these secure facilities, micromanaging the war, obsessing over which village Russia may or may not take on the battlefield in Ukraine in the coming weeks. And he's becoming increasingly detached from the normal affairs of state. And you started to see this actually create some political blowback for him, because the economy is not doing very well. Russia has been shutting down mobile internet in Moscow and all across the country.
Yes.
And that's made people pretty unhappy. Putin's approval ratings took a hit.
So the fear and security measures reportedly increased after a Russian general was killed by a car bomb in Moscow. You talked about the drone strikes. This was a car bomb. And apparently in a heated meeting at the Kremlin, Putin's top military and security personnel blamed each other. So it sort of devolved into a finger-pointing exercise. So, what is the stability right now of Putin's inner circle?
I think the real lesson from this reporting and this intelligence report is that Putin doesn't really have an inner circle anymore, even of the very tight circle of intimates that he had over the previous 25 years that he's been in power. The civilian officials who were told at all that he was planning the war, most of the oligarchs that he built up, who are among his closest friends, with very few exceptions, they're not really involved in this. They don't see him really very often at all, because he's only really regularly who are in his immediate family, or they're directly involved in planning the war. And when you see these generals who are being blown up, unlike Putin, they don't have anything like the kind of security that Putin has. Many of them were hit with bombs right at their homes, at their front doors of their buildings, and there wasn't a dedicated security agency that was really working on protecting these people. The Defense Ministry didn't have one, and so that obviously is going to lead to a lot of squabbling, and that certainly does not make for a cohesive war effort.
Fascinating when Max is saying at this point, Putin doesn't even really have an inner circle anymore. Is this all just paranoia, or does Putin have reason, do you think, at this specific moment, to be this afraid?
No, he's of course paranoid, but fears are real. Putin knows from Russian history that there's one thing that led to massive changes, sometimes revolutions. It's a bad war. If the war goes well, the Russian public never cared about the price to pay for victory. The cost was irrelevant. But bad wars, unwinnable wars, led to changes. It's the Russo-Japanese War in the beginning of the 20th century led to the constitutional monarchy. The bad war of World War I, so the stalemate, led to the collapse of Romanov dynasty. 1989, the retreat from Afghanistan and basically the failure in a Cold War led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And while I may disagree about this, it's the inner circle making decisions about war against Ukraine, there was a kind of consensus that Russia would easily win. But this war now looks unwinnable, and we can just hear it by just reading. Just even pro-war bloggers now, they express doubts that Putin can deliver, and that's the greatest threat to Russian dictator. If people believe he's weak, weakness is something that always led to the disaster.
So your piece today was titled "Putin is in Trouble." You were writing about those military bloggers. You're also talking about, what is the impact, and Max referenced this, but to the internet suddenly being shut down, to having this big May 9th thing that is usually, massive troops and tanks and all of these things be this small pared back thing.
Yeah, look, as bad wars led to the trouble, good wars, won wars, always created, the special aura for the regime. That's why Putin and before him Soviet leaders always tried to capitalize on the World War II, the victory. So that's why the May 9th parade, by the way, Russia always celebrated May 9th because Stalin didn't want to do it on May 8th as the rest of the world, was a kind of sacred date. This is the what made us great. And for Putin to recognize that he should actually not just reduce it, no more tanks, that's already a sign of weakness. But the biggest challenge for him now is that in the beginning of this full-scale invasion, in February 2022, Putin skillfully, managed it by avoiding, Moscow and St. Petersburg, other big cities to be involved. No body bags there. So he looked for either prisons or some, depressed regions or some national republics. So big cities, especially Moscow, never felt the heat of the war. The last few months, it's not just they know that they have to pay the price, and also many oligarchs. They have to also suffer financial losses because all these refineries and plants, somebody owns them.
Right, that are getting hit by the drones.
Exactly. So, and Ukrainians are very successful. Almost every day they hit one or two targets.
One person at the beginning of the war who was very close to Putin was Sergei Shoigu, a former defense minister. He had his ups and downs, but he's been a Putin ally. And now the intel report that Nick Payton-Walsh obtained says, and he's still on the Security Council for Putin, says that Shoigu is, quote, associated with the risk of a coup. All right, I'm curious about two things. Do you think that's the case? And I guess there's also this. If this comes out and is now in public, what happens to Sergei Shoigu when Putin sees this report?
Look, I think it's hearsay. It's just the rumors. But remember Prigozhin. Yeah. It's the Prigozhin's rebellion was also about the war in Ukraine. But at that time, majority of Russian elite, including the army, supported Putin because they thought war in Ukraine was too profitable. Right now, it's a big loss. And again, the war is unwinnable. And the public opinion, of course, it's dictatorship, but it's public opinion among Russian elite, both in economic, political, and of course, military, is now openly expressing doubts that Putin can lead the country. Again, Russian history tells us this is the beginning of the end.
A mystery in the Mediterranean. The possible torpedoing of a Russian ship to stop the Kremlin handing submarine nuclear reactors to North Korea begins in a quiet Spanish port.
This really is the craziest of stories about a Russian Shadow Fleet ship that sank off the coast here in the strangest of circumstances, whose Russian captain confessed to investigators here that it was carrying 2 nuclear reactors, possibly for a submarine headed for an unknown destination. The wreckage of all of which the Russian military spent a huge amount of time and effort destroying.
The incident is shrouded in silence, but concerns the most serious of issues: weapons proliferation between 2 nuclear powers and force being used to stop it. The Ursa Major ship loaded up near St. Petersburg in early December 2024, on paper bound for Vladivostok, with a cargo of 2 huge cranes and over 100 empty containers. It made another stop, loading 2 large manhole covers. You can see them in blue here, along with 2 white pill-shaped objects, which will later prove important. It set sail, a Shadow Fleet ship used by Russia in Syria. The Portuguese Navy followed it from above. You can see the blue covers here, until just before it ran into trouble in Spanish waters.
It was way further out to sea when the Ursa Major, on the 22nd of December 2024, suddenly slowed, and Spanish rescuers noticed this and they radioed to ask if anything was wrong. The ship insisted it was fine and could deal with the situation.
But about 24 hours later, it made a sharp deviation and issued an urgent call for help. The boat was listing, this video shows, filmed from a nearby tanker, but probably not going to sink too fast. The captain of the ship later told investigators he'd seen a 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre hole in the hull, the damaged metal facing inwards, a source close to the investigation said. The captain said it had been followed by 3 explosions on the starboard side of the boat, killing 2 of his crew.
So the Russian military arrive in force and they tell everyone to stay 2 nautical miles away from their ship, the Ursa Major. But the Spanish know they need to conduct rescue operations, so they send this ship to pick up 14 Russian survivors who were brought back here, and that includes the Russian captain, who it seems starts to help investigators piece together some of what's happened. But it's hours later that day that the mood changes over the Ursa Major ship, and the Russian military fire flares over it, and then a series of explosions follow, which Spanish seismic sensors picked up, and they send the ship to the seabed floor.
Moscow demanded their crew back too fast, but it didn't happen immediately.
Spanish rescuers brought the 14 Russian surviving crew to this hotel, and it's here where the Russian captain started telling investigators key information. Now, there's been near silence from the Spanish government about this incident, but they recently released this statement confirming that the Russian captain confessed here to investigators his ship was carrying 2 nuclear reactors, probably meant for submarine use, and he also said he simply wasn't sure if those reactors had fuel in them.
There's no evidence of any contamination. The captain also told investigators he thought he would not stop first at Vladivostok, but instead be told to divert to the North Korean port of Rason, according to the investigation source. That could explain why the extra cranes were needed to help lift the reactors safely. Russia was in North Korea's debt at that time. Kim Jong-un had 2 months earlier sent troops to help Russia's invasion of Ukraine, leaving analysts curious as to what the Kremlin had given him in return. In December 2025, North Korea would claim to have built this, their first nuclear-powered submarine. The Spanish investigation surmised a likely reactor would be this, the VM-4SG, shown in a Russian submarine here on state TV. Its dimensions are not public, but CNN analysis shows reactor vessels match the shape of at least one of the white objects seen in St. Petersburg's container port on December the 4th, both gone by December the 11th, when the ship had left.
If these reactors have come out of decommissioned submarines, then they will be radioactive, although obviously not as much as if they were fully loaded with fuel.
How incredibly rare is this kind of transfer of technology? This is quite serious stuff,
It
right?
is very. It's not something that's undertaken lightly, and it's only something that's ever done between very close allies.
So it's a major move by Moscow
Absolutely.
to decide to do this.
Very, very.
Troubling?
Potentially, yes, particularly if you're South Korea.
Everything may have been on the bottom of the sea, but the Russians weren't done yet. And according to a source familiar with the investigation, about a week after the incident, a Russian research vessel called the Yantar, linked in the past to all sorts of allegations against Moscow, sat over the wreckage for about 5 days, and 4 more explosions followed, possibly the Russians destroying what was left of the wreckage.
In the months after, the US may have shown interest in the site, twice sending a rare WC-135R Constant Phoenix, usually secretly sniffing out traces of nuclear activity in Russia's Arctic or over Iran, over the path of the Ursa Major, weaving low at 5,000 feet. One had flown a similar route 13 months earlier, perhaps suggesting its routine. The aircraft's US base declined to provide any details. Spanish lawmakers have urgently sought answers, but got few.
Cuando alguien no te dice claramente y no te da la información claramente y extensa de lo que pides, por lo menos sospechas que te está escondiendo algo, por supuesto que sí. La caja negra nos han dicho que se ha hundido con el barco, que está a 2.500 metros de profundidad y que la operación hace, por su alto riesgo, imposible. Entonces yo creo que la caja negra la tiene alguien, pero claro, no sabemos si es el gobierno de España o los propios rusos que la han localizado, ¿no?
So why did the ship sink? The Spanish investigation said the first impact was likely from a projectile called a supercavitating torpedo that fires air in front of itself to reach very high speed. Others point to something simpler.
The hole in the hull that the captain talked about, 0.5 metre by 0.5 metre.
Yeah.
What could make something like that?
From the description I've seen, and the description you've given, that hole to me sounds like a limpet mine. It sounds like a shaped charge explosive that was placed against the hull by somebody or something and detonated.
The Russian owners immediately called the sinking a targeted terrorist attack. They, the Russian, Spanish and British militaries, did not reply to a request for comment, and the Pentagon declined to. There are few Western militaries operating there, capable of noticing, tracking and stopping a cargo like this. All sides, it seems, happy for this secret to stay on the sea floor.